scripture reading is Psalm 16. Hear thou the word of God. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the holy ones in the land, they are the noble, in whom is all my delight. Those who choose another God multiply their sorrows. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names upon my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion, and my cup you hold my lot. The boundary lines have failed for me in pleasant places, have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore.
Our second scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, at what large stones and what large buildings." Jesus asked him, "You see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked Jesus privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that it's about to happen?" Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. You hear of wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed. Do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Friends, this is the word of God.
Thank you.
With Thanksgiving coming up this week, with all the work that we have done this year, I had this plan in my little brain that perhaps we would spend the month of November with a sermon series about gratitude. We've had opportunities to give thanks for the people who have supported us. We've had opportunities to reflect on the great gifts that God has given us, and now that Thanksgiving is just days away, focusing on gratitude seems very important, just right. But how do we give thanks when it feels like the world is ending? For our sisters and brothers in Cameroon, where violence continues and hope dwindles. For our sisters and brothers in California, where fires devour and destroy. For our sisters and brothers in the Merrimack Valley, who still don't have gas while the snow has begun to fall. For our sisters and brothers facing cancer, loss. One more obstacle: gratitude can be really difficult to find. I think it's maybe appropriate then that in the passage of Mark that's assigned to be read today, Jesus' words are not about gratitude, but about destruction, apocalyptic destruction. So I think we need to go back a little bit and get into the shoes of Jesus and those disciples, right? These earliest followers of Jesus were Jewish people. It wasn't until a few hundred years later that Christianity and Judaism really became clearly two separate, different religions. And there were many sects and branches of Jewish practice and interpretation at the time. People were really trying to figure out how to be faithful to the God that they loved. The Jewish people living in Jerusalem were also an occupied people, living under the foreign rule of Rome, oppressed, poor, living in constant fear. To people who live in this kind of reality, those who society considers to be outside of the center of what's normal and good, apocalyptic stories serve perhaps a different purpose than they do for us now. Jewish people at the time of Jesus were no stranger to the genre of apocalyptic literature. It's all over the Bible, in Daniel and Isaiah, of course, Revelation, right? But to them it was not a kind of blueprint for how the world would end. There were no bestsellers about the end times in the first century. To a community suffering under harsh injustice and apocalypse was a story of hope and promise. Apocalypse comes from a Greek word that means to unveil, to reveal. And the people believed that these stories revealed that the way things were was not the way that God intended them to be, and that one day, maybe even starting right now, things were going to change. Central to the apocalyptic genre is the conviction that God controls history and that God will rescue the world from evil that seems to prevail. Welcome thoughts indeed in times of fear and uncertainty. The Gospel of Mark itself comes from a time when it felt like the world was ending. It was written down, Bible scholars think, around the end of the first century, which coincides with a very important event in the lives of Jesus' followers. Because of the increasing boldness of some Jewish leaders to stand up for their people, to fight for power, Rome decided to teach them a lesson, mounting a formal siege against Jerusalem that resulted in the total destruction of God's temple. For God's people, this destruction was not just an inconvenient rebuilding project, it cut them to their very core. The temple was the location of God's presence on earth. It was the center of their worship. How would they be with God? How would they worship God without it? They had lost a foundational belief upon which they had built their lives. And beyond that, the temple was huge. It was impressive. It had seemed inviolable. How could this have happened? To this early Christian community living with the reality of this destruction, Jesus' words about the temple ring a little differently. Even this large and impressive building, he says, is not untouchable. There's something going on that's bigger than all of us, Jesus tells his disciples, as the world struggles to give birth to something new. This feeling that the world might be ending, that things we once knew are no longer trustworthy, that things as we once knew them are over, long gone. The feeling was not new then, and it is not old now. It's almost a constant of human experience. This passage was written in a different way in the early 20th century by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats in a piece you might know called The Second Coming. He writes, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." You might recognize some lines from this poem because "Things Fall Apart" is also the title of the classic Nigerian novel by Chinua Achebe, a story about the way that colonialism threatened and destroyed traditional African culture in many places, causing a kind of apocalypse of its own, an apocalypse that feels now fully realized in Cameroon and other places we hold dear. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. and the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Whether at a personal level, or communal, or national, or global level, we know this feeling when everything seems to fall apart around us. When our central beliefs and strongholds no longer feel like they can weather the storm, when we have lost our innocent trust in the large buildings and the great stones. But Yeats' poem doesn't end there. He continues, surely some revelation is at hand. And that's what Jesus tells his disciples as well. They want details. When will the temple be destroyed? How can we know? How can we stop it from happening? Jesus doesn't answer them at all. Instead, he just tells them the truths that we all know about life. Things will fall apart. The center will not hold. But do not be afraid. Because all of these things mean that something new is about to be born. Several years ago at a gathering of women faith leaders in New York City, I had the great pleasure to meet a young woman named Valerie Carr. She was a Sikh who was then a law student at Harvard. I knew next to nothing about the Sikh religion. Her stories of wonder and of revolutionary love were so beautiful, so powerful. I became an immediate fan of hers than anything that she would do. And almost a year ago, she began what she called the Revolutionary Love Project. She calls it a movement to ground our lives and politics in the ethic of love. And I want to just read to you from a speech that she gave on New Year's Eve last year. It was at a watch night service at the Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. I just think her words are perfect for this passage and this moment. So if you'll indulge me, listen to what Valerie has to tell us. She says, on Christmas Eve, 103 years ago, my grandfather waited in a dark and dank cell. He sailed by steamship across the Pacific Ocean from India to America, leaving behind colonial rule. But when he landed on American shores, immigration officials saw his dark skin, his tall turban worn as part of his Sikh faith, and saw him not as a brother but as foreign, as suspect, and threw him behind bars where he languished for months until a single man, a white man, a lawyer named Henry Marshall, filed a writ of habeas corpus that released him. In the aftermath of September 11th, when hate violence exploded in these United States, a man that I called Uncle was murdered. I tried to stand up. I became a lawyer, like the man who freed my grandfather, and I joined a generation of activists fighting detentions and deportation, surveillance and special registration, hate crimes, and racial profiling. And after 15 years, with every film, with every lawsuit, with every campaign, I thought we were making the nation safer for the next generation. And then she writes, my son was born. In America today, as we enter an era of enormous rage, as white nationalists hail this moment as their great awakening, as hate acts against Sikhs and our Muslim brothers and sisters are at an all-time high, I know that there will be moments, whether on the streets or in the schoolyards, where my son will be seen as foreign, as suspect, as a terrorist. Just as black bodies are still seen as criminal, brown bodies are still seen as illegal, trans bodies are still seen as immoral, indigenous bodies are still seen as savage, the bodies of women and girls seen as someone else's property. And when we see these bodies not as brothers and sisters, then it becomes easy to bully them, to rape them, to allow policies that neglect them, that incarcerate them, that kill them. Yes, the future is dark. I close my eyes and I see the darkness of my grandfather's cell. And I can feel the spirit of ever-rising optimism in the Sikh tradition within him. So the mother in me asks, what if? What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our country is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now, those who survived occupation and genocide, slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault? What if they are whispering in our ears, "You are brave"? What does the midwife tell us to do? Breathe, and then push. Because if we don't push, we will die. If we don't push, our nation will die. So tonight we will breathe. Tomorrow we will labor in love, through love. And your revolutionary love is the magic we will show our children. How do we give thanks when the world is ending? I think this could be how. We breathe, and then we push. Leaning into the labor that Jesus says is beginning, is always beginning, always around us. If the way things fall apart is a sign that the birth pangs are starting, it means something is about to be born. The fear and pain of this moment are not the whole story, not the end of the story. Something new is coming. But if we don't push, we will die. Friends, with grateful hearts, let us welcome the new life of Jesus Christ into every fearful and broken corner of our lives, of our world, breathing in the power of the Spirit. And then, with God's help around